Okay.
Are we ready?
You're ready.
Okay. I'm Phil Kindred, and this is my grandson, Luke Kindred, and we're here at the City Library tonight for a book signing session, and just to sell a few and to spread the word about our book about Glenmore Mansion. It's kind of an interesting story, I guess, as to how we got started. Luke really started, his grandmother and I, in an interest in Glenmore. He was about 14, weren't you, Luke?
Yes.
And he wanted to join as a student, and he had to work his way in. He finally worked one spring in their garden market, and then the next winter they had the Christmas tours, and Becky and I went, and then we joined, and since then we've been hooked. We've been docents over there and giving tours during the summer and other special occasions and things. But we first got interested in we started reading the cards they gave us as we took the tours, and we kept thinking, some of this information doesn't seem quite right. So Luke and I both had been working on Ancestry, doing our own family genealogies and things, and Luke again got me started. And but anyway, we got to doing genealogy on the Jarnagans and the Branners, the two families that were living at Glenmore, that built Glenmore and lived there for many, many years. And as we researched it, we just kept learning more and more information about the house and finding things that seemed to have been just laying around for 45 years at the house since the APTA had ownership of it. So anyway, we worked for about 2 years. Luke, I call Luke my discovery and research person, because he's good at that kind of thing, much better than I am on the internet. And he found various things. Luke, you might mention something you found about the Branner family. Actually ran a girls' school there at the house for about 3 years. And Luke found some information. Luke, you tell them a little bit about what you found.
Well, I was looking online, and I happened to notice an entry in an online catalog mentioning some materials at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And we took a trip up there, and going through their archives, we found a lot of documents relating to daily life at the girls' school. And it really opened a door and let us know about what life was like during that time at Glenmore.
Yeah, not only that, you found also the diary of one of the teachers who was there. Where was it?
We found the diary of a teacher named Benjamin Atkins, and we were able to obtain a copy of it. And he made entries about the school, about what he taught there, and about the graduation ceremony they had. And that was a fascinating insight.
Yeah, there was lots of interesting things that Luke turned up in his surfing the internet that Granddad would never have found by himself. So, but basically our book is a compilation of things. When we started volunteering at Glenmore, the first thing I asked Joanne Vest, who's the president over there of the APTA, I said, Joanne, is there a book or a pamphlet or something I could read that would give me a thumbnail overview of this Glenmore and its history? And there was not anything. So started looking around. We've had some earlier writers like Dr. Muncie, for example, who had written the history of Jefferson County, and Gene Bible, who had done that also. And they all mentioned Glenmore and gave a page or two about its history, but they didn't have much detail. It was just general information. So what we tried to do in our book here was to talk about the mansion itself, the building, what's involved there and what it looks like. We even have detailed drawings of it. Then we talk about the first owners and the builders, the Branner family, John Roper Branner. And then we talk about the second family, the Jarnagan family. And just to give you a quick idea, the Branner family, even though they had lived in the Mossy Creek area since 1835, 1838, they'd been there a long time. They really came from Dandridge, and John Roper Branner, those of you that travel around Dandridge know that the Roper Tavern and the Roper store over there, just above the courthouse in Dandridge, those were John Roper Branner's grandparents. So there's a connection on both sides of the county to that family. But the Ropers, John Roper, the sad part about his life is he and his wife dreamed about that house and had all the materials gathered for it and everything, and they started construction in 1868, and then he dies in February of 1869. Never sleeps a night in the house. And so Deborah, his wife, finishes the house up, but only lives there about 13 years. So then they sell that property to the Jarnigans, Milton Preston Jarnigan. And the Jarnigan family, he raises his family there, and then one of his sons comes back, Frank Jarnigan, and lives there for 53 years and operates the farm and the grist mill and so forth. And so the Jarnigan clan, 2 generations really, lived there about 83 years. So they were there quite a long time. There's a lot of history related to them. So those 2 families are covered in our book. And then we spend just a few pages on the Branner Institute, the one we talked about that he dug up information over at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And then we spend some time talking about Mossy Creek and the grist mill. And you mentioned that to a lot of folks, and they don't even know there was a grist mill because it's been gone since 1969. But it was there from about 1838 until 1969 and served the Mossy Creek community and the surrounding area for almost 110 years. But it burned, and the roads have been reconfigured a little bit. Different bridges have been built down on that end of the creek, and you would not know that a mill ever existed there today. We also give some pages to the Branner Cemetery, which is within a quarter of a mile of the Branner, or the Glenmore structure. And it's just across the railroad track, and basically all the Branners are buried over there. And some other community people as well. Colonel John Talbot, Talbot's namesake, is buried there, along with his two wives, one on either side, have the same name. Beersheba was their name. How do you find 2 wives with the same name? But he did. And then we have a section on the APTA, Association for the Preservation of Tennessee Antiquities. They own the property, and they have had it. It was a gift to them by the Jarnigan heirs back in 1970. So they've had that property for around 45 years. And the only deal was, we'll give you the house if you'll keep it open as a house museum. So it's been a house museum now for about 45 years, operated by the local. Originally it was the Jefferson County chapter of the APTA, but after they got the house, they renamed themselves the Glenmore chapter of the APTA. So we spent some time talking about their ownership and the challenges of restoration and keeping an old 150-year-old house intact and available as a house museum. So that's a kind of an overview of our book. It is not it's written in a narrative form, but it's not a story that has a theme that runs completely through it. It's just parts and pieces of it. But sometimes when you spend time reading the lives of these people, you think it's almost like a novel when you start reading all the things that happened to them. But what can you add that I've been rambling on here?
I feel like you covered everything. It's just an in-depth look at the history of Glenmore and really our area, because the history of Glenmore ties in so closely with the history of Jefferson City.
One of the things I think that's interesting about the Branners, John Roper actually became president of the East Tennessee Virginia Railroad for about 8 years. He was actually president up until just maybe a month or 2 before he died. I think he had been in poor health, and therefore they were probably going to elect somebody else, and then he has this stroke and dies. By all accounts, he was a type A personality. He smoked cigars. He was a good candidate for a stroke, Dr. Stroke. And so that's probably, according to the death certificate information, that's probably what killed him. They called it something else, but it was what we'd call a stroke today. But died pretty quickly. He was only 47 years old when he died. And I think that family to me is, they were impressive. They would have been millionaires in today's economy. But they had some sadness in their life too. They had, in the 45 years, they were 45 years old when they started building Glenmore. Actually, they called it the Oaks Mansion. But they were 45 years old. They had already had 8 children by that time. And only one child was still living when they started that house in 1868. 6 of them had died rather young, anywhere from a few months to 6 years of age. One son lived to be 19. He was the oldest. He got typhoid fever. He had joined the Confederate forces and was encamped at Cumberland Gap. Got typhoid fever and died. Never fought a day in his life. He just reported for duty, pretty much. And then their oldest son, William, the second son, became the only son by the time they built the house. And I think he must have had a interesting and perhaps a sad life. I think about William. He had all these brothers and sisters, and by the time he was about 16, they were all dead. The younger ones had passed. Then his older brother died of typhoid. So, I don't know how that would affect you. But anyway, I think he probably had an interesting life. He continued to live in Jefferson City, did various things, but had good inheritance from his father's estate. And so there's not much indication that he ever did any kind of productive work or anything. He was a justice of the peace. You know that from census data. You look at census data, try to see what people did. But anyway, it's an interesting family. And the Jarnagans, we could talk and make you nauseous about Jarnagans, but they're a very interesting family, and they have some extended. Can you talk a little bit about one of the Jarnagan girls that married an Ivy Leaguer and lived in Pittsburgh, and her son that became Thomas?
Okay, well, Martha Scott Jarnagan grew up at Glenmore, and she married Thomas Mellon Evans there in 1900. He was from the Pittsburgh area, I do believe. Mm-hmm. And you might recognize the name Mellon. It's a banking family, well known. But he went on to be very involved in, was it a hospital?
Yes.
In Pittsburgh, but anyway, he passed away at an early age, leaving Martha widowed and left to raise her son, who, he had a different name, but she probably renamed him Thomas Mellon Evans Jr. And the gist of it is his mother then passed away, and he was raised by other members of the Jarnagan family. But he went on to become one of the most successful Wall Street raiders, one of the first ones in the 1960s, and became fabulously wealthy. And there's actually a book written on him.
The White Sharks of Wall Street.
Yes, it was published a few years back.
Yeah, but I mean, the more you delve into these people's lives and follow their little journeys, it's just amazing. And there's a lot of fodder in there for people to write a book about, which this lady did, write The White Sharks of Wall Street, about Thomas Mellon Evans Jr. I'd never heard of the guy until we ran into him doing genealogy, and then you run into these other things about it. But there are other interesting folks through this too. One of the things that Luke and I both have gotten interested in is the 3 years that place was a girls' school, the Branner Institute for Young Ladies. It was run by one of John Roper's brothers, Joseph Ayers Branner, and don't know why we can't find any good documentation to say why these people did these things. We just know that they did it, and the school was there, and it was they taught math and Latin and languages and music and art and different things. It was more like a finishing school probably than a bona fide college of any kind, but they had guest speakers that would come in, and one of the speakers that came in was a cousin to John Roper Branner. His name was John Casper Branner, and his life is amazing too. He was born in Dandridge, spent a little time in school in Newmarket at the Presbyterian school that was down there at one time, and then went on to become an educated man, a geologist. He was the state geologist for Arkansas. He traveled all over South and Central America, ended up being the president eventually of Stanford University, the second president of Stanford University. So, I mean, you just run into these characters related to this family, just fascinating stuff. And they, you know, what I got sidetracked here, he came back here once and gave a lecture at Glenmore at the school, when it was a school, about
Geology.
geology. Yeah, it was about geology. But he wrote extensively, and we found lots of articles that he wrote for like Popular Science magazine and different things. He wrote on language, he wrote on culture. He was really a broad-based intellect. But geology was his thing, and then eventually academia as president of the university out there in California. Luke, I don't know where to go with it now. We could talk you into the ground here, I guess.
Can you tell us a little bit about how, when you were doing your research, how you organized or what your research methods were?
Help me out, Luke.
I don't know if we really had a method. So little research had been done that we just explored every avenue we could and just looked for every bit of information we could get.
Yeah. I'll tell you one thing that Luke spent 2 summers ago doing was the loose documents that we found at Glenmore. Over the 45 years of APT, it had that. Someone at some point in the past had made a stab at like organizing the 300 or 400 books that we found there. Okay? But nobody had really, we found dresser drawers and drawers in bookcases that were just loose papers in them. Hey folks, come in. But anyway, the loose papers were in there, and Luke spent the summer, pretty much a full summer, separating things out, trying to identify them by categories, and then Luke, tell them how you did organize that.
Well, we have the proper archives now. Everything is organized by type of document, so we have business records relating to the Jarnigan farm there. We have correspondence. We have actually schoolwork done by the Jarnigan children, which some of it has shed some light on things because they wrote stories about growing up and things like that. But we have it all organized in archival folders and document boxes and a finding aid. So when you're doing research now, you can find what you're looking for, which is very helpful.
But that was a bigger undertaking than I think Luke thought it was originally. But he kept finding stuff, and it took pretty much all summer and a little bit more to get it organized. But at least now it's in acid-proof folders and boxes and things, and he did the finding aid. So if somebody wants to use it in the future, they can find something as opposed to just sorting through a bunch of loose papers, you know. So that was one of the things. We've also, too, we've been able to communicate either by email or in person with some of the descendants of these families. The Jarnigan family, we've met and continue to email back and forth with Clay Bradley. Milton Preston Jarnigan was his great-grandfather. Frank Jarnigan was his grandfather. His mother's name was Mary. Those of you folks who have lived here a while may remember some of those names. But anyway, he lives in the Midwest, and he's a commodities trader, but doesn't get back here often. But we communicate by email. He shared pictures and things, and most recent, and this is exciting for us to find, his mother had been given about 43 pages of handwritten reminiscings by Milton Preston Jarnigan during his days in the Confederate Army. Milton didn't fight, but he served as a judge. He was a lawyer by trade, so he served as a judge advocate of the East Tennessee, Virginia district. So at some point, he was about 65 years old, I think, and somebody urged him to sit down and write his reminiscings about his years as a Confederate judge. So we're in the process now of transcribing his poor handwriting into something that's readable. So I'm anxious to get that done so we can share that. And of course, Clay Bradley, who sent it, had never taken time to transcribe it either. He just looked at it and said, great granddad had terrible penmanship, you know. But we keep finding things. The more you keep looking, not find as much as we did when we were heavy into the looking part of it, but still finding things. And then we've also gotten to meet some Branner descendants who are living today in Winston-Salem. And they've been over, and they've actually been here twice, once before we got engaged with Glenmore, and then this past summer they came back. And they have returned some of the artifacts or family things, like they brought back a silver service last summer. It has the big B etched into the silver pitcher, and a couple of little cups with it, I think, had the B on them. And also a needlepoint crewel work that Deborah Branner, John Roper's wife, did when she was 16 years old and a student at Salem College, Old Salem College in Winston-Salem. So, you know, we keep getting little pieces of information and things that are quite interesting. They've also shared some pictures of things that they had in their family archives. And then we've communicated with a Mr. Herndon who lives in Wheaton, Illinois. He was not a descendant, but his wife was. She's now deceased, but he continues to be interested in it, and we communicate, and he shares, he sends letters or copies of things, and he's an elderly fellow, and he's going through, you know, like people do, trying to decide what you do with something, and that's what he's going through right now. So he's shared some things with us electronically. We've not gotten any hard copies, but he still has a couple of the original Samuel Shaver portraits of that family. Has one of the son, George, that died during the Confederacy with typhoid fever. And then he has one of Deborah's original John Shaver portrait too. And they're huge. They're like 5 foot tall portraits, oil portraits that Samuel Shaver did. Anything else? Yeah. So it'd be all right if we wind down at this point?
Yeah. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, any questions?
Okay, one last thing. If we want to get copies after today, where do we go to buy a copy of the book?
Well, basically, we're not marketing. We may have some at the Creek Cafe.
Okay.
Libby may do some of those for us down there. And then we'll have them at the Glenmore gift shop.
Okay.
So you could call the Glenmore number, or you could contact me personally, and I'd be sure you would find one.
And we have 2 more book signings.
And we have 2 more book signings. We're going to do one at the Creek on Saturday morning from 10:30 to 11:30, and then we'll be at Glenmore. And it sounds like the weather's going to be terrible Sunday, but we're going to do one at Glenmore from 2 to 4, I think, Sunday afternoon, if anybody wants to drive up there. But it's really a piece for Glenmore. Luke and I have just given the responsibility for this to the Glenmore APTA chapter. Roughly 50%, well, all of the profit from this thing will go to the Glenmore Restoration Fund. So we're not in this to try to make any money off, which we're not going to anyway, because there's not a big market for this kind of book. But we think it'll be a nice piece that will serve Glenmore well for many years and give people information easily and in one package. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.